Shalom YouTube, it's Fletch. Today we are changing out the spindles on the mower deck of our John Deere LA 105. And as you can see, so far we've got the mowing deck disconnected. Not too terribly difficult. Remove a cotter pin that holds up that brace arm, cotter pin that holds that leveling arm, and then one in the front there where the holds the front up. And so we're about to pull the whole mowing deck out of there and replace it with these new spindles that I ordered off of Amazon. And these are the pulley goes on top of each one of these up here, and then the blade mounts under there. And so I'll show you guys that a little bit later, but that's what we're working on today, and enjoying some morning coffee. And here's a tip when it comes to working on things: take your camera with you and take pictures and video of how it works. So like right here, I'm taking this video right now specifically so I see how this belt serpentines through here, how it goes under on one side and over on the other, what the path is, where all these little connector arms hook up for the brake and all that, so that when the time comes and I gotta put this back together, when I'm done rebuilding it, I know how to put it all back together. Hey guys, and here's another tip. This is a Chicago Electric aka Harbor Freight impact wrench, and this has been a great investment for me. This thing has more than paid for itself. And you know, just for doing light jobs around your homestead every now and then, something like this I think it would work just fine, especially if you get, you know, their 2 years replacement program with it. If it ever goes bad, basically you can just take it in and they give you a new one. So not a bad investment at all. And for the type of things I'm gonna be doing around here, works very well. And today what I'll be using it for is getting the nuts off of these pulleys on the top. The mower blades are beneath, and so I'll be using it to get the nuts off the mower blades as well. And then we'll pull out the spindles and I'll show you that. Alright, so here is the mowing deck with the pulleys pulled off. So this is the replacement spindle, and it mounts underneath like that. And so what you're looking at here is, hang on a second here, I'm going to do it one-handed. What you're looking at here then is that right there. That's the top. And that mounts up from underneath, and then these 4 screws right here, you have to back out. Those are self-tapping screws, and so we'll back those out, and after we take the blade off on the bottom, of course, and we'll take a look and we'll try to find out what failed, because right now it's locked up, and I'll show you that in a minute. Here's the bottom of the mowing deck, and as you can see, this spindle is still okay, but it's really noisy. And I know from experience that typically about the time that one spindle goes, the other's not too far behind, because what happens is if these bolts get fatigued and they start breaking, or the bearings go out, and so, you know, same thing, when one goes out the other typically does. And here is what's causing me to have to do this. This one is just locked in here, and somehow, as you can see right down here, it's actually touching this outer frame of the mowing deck. So somehow this whole spindle assembly tilted down and got cut up on there. So we'll have to find out if it's the bearings that went bad on it, or if it is some of the bolts cracked and busted in there, and so it allowed it to shift just a little bit. So one sec. All right, so here we are with the mower blade off, and as you can see, it does spin. So it's not the bearings that went bad. Evidently one of these 4 self-tapping screws is gone bad in there or something that allowed the whole spindle to shift, because it's a little gritty for sure, but it still spins pretty freely. So the next step is to flip it back over and start backing out each one of these 4 self-tapping screws. Alright, so this is what I'm working on now. This is the bottom side of the mowing deck where the spindles go, and I just used my drill with a wire brush on it to buff this out to see if I can find any cracks on there. One thing that I can tell is missing is that at some point this mowing deck was rebuilt, and there's supposed to be a metal reinforcing ring that goes around here. That's not there, and unfortunately, since it's been 2 weeks since my grass is cut, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get around to getting that replaced today either. But I am going to do something about this where the paint's all come off, especially in this area, to keep it from rusting, especially here in the Ozarks. So what I'm going to do is, and yes, there's stuff everywhere because I'm fixing bikes today as well, but nav jelly or navel jelly, you just kind of paint this on there, and then it mixes with the rust and it creates its own primer, and so it's a really good way to stop rust. You just, like I said, use a brush like we were back there, and keeps it from turning bad. And here's another application for it. These are the self-tapping screws that, or bolts rather, that go up inside the spindle, and they're not pre-tapped. When you turn them in, they tap themselves as they're going in. As you look right now, yes, they're tapped because the bolt did it, not because they came that way. So and this is actually the spindle that came out, and I can't find anything wrong with it. The bearing doesn't seem really overly gritty or bad, so I think I'm going to save it for a rainy day, and probably clean up the grease zerg here and give it some grease and lube it up good, and wrap it up and save it for a rainy day. But I already invested the money in the replacement parts, so I think I'm just going to use those, seeing as how I got it all torn apart. And speaking of that, okay, 2 schools of thought on something like this. One school of thought is you don't ever replace anything until it actually breaks. The other school of thought is if it might break someday, go ahead and replace it. So these bolts that hold the spindle to the deck, the spindle right there to the deck, tend to fatigue over time, and they will crack and break as you hit rocks or big twigs and different things like that as you're mowing. And so depending on who you talk to depends on what the best strategy here is. So if you're the type of person that thinks, well, you know, I know that this is the weak point of this setup and eventually that's going to break, so I'm just going to buy a new one, now's the time to replace these. They're not terribly expensive, but if you buy them from like the John Deere dealer, yeah, they are. So my suggestion to you is to find just a local hardware store, or even order them off Amazon or something like that, and just replace them at that time. The other school of thought is to simply clean off the threads good, and then put a little bit of the nav jelly on them, and then just run them back in. And another thing is, when you're taking these out, if you're of the school of thought that you want to try to reuse these, if that is your school of thought, then you don't want to use an impact wrench when you're taking these out, because you want to start it real slow as you're taking them out. And otherwise, because if the impact drill hits it real hard the first time, a lot of times it just snaps them all off. And I've talked to guys that work in quote-unquote professional, you know, lawnmower repair shops, and that's what they do. They just include that as the cost of business. They put their impact wrench on there and they just snap all 4 of them as they're going, because they're just going to replace them anyways. So 2 schools of thought there, depending on what makes sense to you. Here are the areas where I put on the navel jelly, and you can see that it's dry now, and it kind of flakes off, which is fine. That's the way it's supposed to be. But underneath, it turned the metal a brownish color, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And so that's all primed now, and so that's good to go. And then on the top, it was even a little worse. Flip it over a little bit. You can see where all of that, where the paint was cracked and peeling off. But I saw somewhere, I don't remember exactly where it was right today, but where they sell John Deere yellow paint now, which is you know, specifically meant for this application. Not mine specifically, but for this color. But so one of these days I'm going to go buy some of that, and I'm going to fix that area up in there as well. But down here you can see where I did the same thing. So now I'm just going to start working in reverse and putting the new spindles on. And when I'm doing that, I'm going to try to figure out what happened to that spindle and how it ended up in there all cattywampus and lodged against this right here. It may have just come loose enough that that it did this deal because it got loose enough, because none of the spindles were cracked or broke anywhere that I could see. None of the bolts were broke that I can see. So I think that somehow it just wasn't quite in there tight enough. So but anyways, I've got the navel jelly on there, nav jelly, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to start the process in reverse. And so here is my bolts. And if you've never seen this on this type of a bolt, what makes that a self-tapping bolt is, you see how that's tapered going all the way up, and what happens is as you push that into the soft it's an alloy that spindle is made out of, and it just threads itself up in there. And so it helps if you kind of back it out every once in a while, just screwing it up in there to make sure that you don't get it all bound up in there and snapping it off. Here we are, we have the first spindle installed. An important thing to remember is if your spindles have grease zergs on them, you definitely want to put them on the outside, because you definitely want to be trying to reach in between here, right, when you're doing, or even there or there, sticking out, so that you can get your grease gun on that zerg and get it serviced. But either way, it's a pain in the butt, because you got your safety Sally cover that's going to go on here and protect where the belt goes through the pulley on top. So there's the first one down, and get the second one on, and then we'll get the blades and pulleys on, and we'll get the covers back on, and we'll get it remounted, and we should be done. Let's see how it goes.